The baby wouldn't stop crying. The sound filled every corner of the big, lonely house, echoing through rooms that once carried laughter. The widower sat by the window, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. Just weeks ago his wife had been there, smiling, singing, alive. Now she was gone, and the cries of the newborn tore through his heart like a wound that refused to close. He had tried to be strong. He had tried to hold the baby, to feed her, to quiet her. But the child didn't understand loss. She only wanted warmth, milk, and a mother who wasn't there. Servants came and went, whispering about how cursed the house had become. One by one they left. Only the old cook remained, a woman who had worked in the kitchen for years, known for her heavy steps and kind eyes. Every day she watched him struggle. She heard the cries, the silence that followed, and then the cries again. She wanted to help but didn't know how. The master was proud and distant, a man who had built his world on control. But now that world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to ask for help. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with gold and fire, she stood at the kitchen door, wringing her hands. She took a deep breath and walked toward him. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Sir, no one wants a fat girl," she said quietly, almost ashamed, "but I can nurse the baby." For a moment he didn't move. The room felt still, as if time itself had stopped to listen. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her face was tired, her apron stained, her hands rough from years of work. But there was something in her eyes, something steady and kind. The baby's cries filled the air again, soft and desperate. The widower closed his eyes. Then he nodded. "Then stay," he said softly. Those two words hung between them like a promise neither of them fully understood yet. Outside, the last light of day faded, and the house, for the first time in weeks, began to feel alive again. Morning light crept slowly through the curtains, spilling pale gold across the floor. The house was silent except for the sound of a baby breathing softly in the next room. For the first time in weeks, the widower woke to quiet. No cries, no restless pacing, no sleepless exhaustion. He sat up slowly, his chest tight with disbelief. It almost felt wrong, that sudden calm after so many nights of noise. He rose, walked to the nursery, and stood in the doorway. The old cook sat in a rocking chair by the window, humming softly. The baby slept soundly in her arms, her tiny fist curled against the woman's chest. Sunlight touched both of them, bathing the scene in warmth that felt unfamiliar. The widower watched in silence, not wanting to disturb the peace. Something in his chest shifted, something heavy that had sat there for too long. The cook looked up and met his gaze. She smiled, small and unsure, as if asking for permission to keep holding the child. He gave a faint nod. Then, almost awkwardly, he cleared his throat and said, "She seems calm." "She's had enough to eat," the woman replied softly. "She just needed comfort." Comfort. The word lingered. It wasn't something he'd thought about in a long time. Not since before his wife died, not since laughter had turned into silence. He turned away quickly and muttered something about needing to check the fields, though he hadn't worked them in weeks. The truth was, he just didn't know what else to say. The cook stayed behind, moving quietly through the house once the baby was asleep. She tidied the kitchen, cleaned the dishes, and prepared breakfast without being asked. When he finally returned, the smell of warm bread and fresh coffee filled the air. It felt like the house was breathing again. He sat at the table out of habit, unsure what to do with his hands. She poured his coffee carefully, her movements steady but shy. "You should eat, sir," she said. "You've gone too long without proper meals." He wanted to tell her that food didn't taste right anymore, that nothing did. But he saw the effort in her eyes, the simple act of trying to care for a man who'd given up on being cared for, and so he nodded and ate. The bread was warm. The coffee was strong. For the first time in days, he felt human. As the day went on, he watched her move through the house with quiet purpose. She didn't speak much. She didn't pry. She just did what needed to be done, washing linens, tending to the baby, humming little tunes under her breath. Each sound she made filled a space that had been empty for too long. He found himself stopping at the nursery door more often. Sometimes he stood there just to listen to the soft rhythm of her voice as she sang to the baby. The songs were old lullabies she probably learned as a child herself. There was something steady in her voice, something honest. Days turned into weeks, and slowly life began to slip back into the house. The cook never complained, never asked for more than what she had. She slept near the nursery, waking at every sound the baby made. When the widower passed by late at night, he sometimes saw her sitting in that same chair, half asleep but still rocking gently, as if afraid the baby might remember loneliness if she stopped. The townsfolk noticed the change, too. They whispered about it when they passed. The lonely man's house no longer looked abandoned. Smoke rose from the chimney again. Curtains fluttered in open windows. They wondered who had brought life back to that quiet home. Inside, the widower felt the difference but didn't know how to explain it. He still spoke little, still carried grief like a shadow, but it didn't crush him the way it used to. Sometimes when he looked at the baby, her small hands, her steady breathing, he felt something stirring, something dangerously close to hope. One afternoon, he found himself watching the cook as she worked by the stove. Her sleeves were rolled up and strands of gray hair escaped her bun. The sunlight from the window caught the edge of her face, and for a fleeting second, he saw not the woman everyone dismissed as plain, but someone strong, someone who had stayed when no one else did. He wanted to thank her but didn't know how. Gratitude felt too small a word for what she had given, so he said nothing, only nodded when she offered him a plate of food. She didn't need words, it seemed. She understood the silence between them, the kind that came not from distance, but from mutual respect. At night, when the baby cried, he no longer stayed in his room pretending not to hear. He'd rise, walk to the nursery, and find the cook already there. Sometimes she'd look up and smile faintly, as if to say, "It's all right now." He'd stand nearby, awkward at first, then gently take the baby's hand or whisper to her until she settled again. It was a strange, quiet teamwork neither of them had planned. The days grew warmer. The fields outside turned green again. The widower began to work the land once more, his hands remembering the feel of earth. Each evening when he returned, he'd find the baby laughing softly in the cook's arms. The sound always stopped him in his tracks. It was the same house, the same walls, but it no longer felt haunted. And though he rarely spoke it aloud, he knew the truth. It wasn't time that had healed the house. It was her, the cook, who'd said those hesitant words that changed everything. "No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby." She hadn't offered pity or beauty. She'd offered care, simple, human, steady care, and it was enough to bring a broken man and a motherless child back to life. The widower didn't fully understand it yet, but each day that passed made him see more clearly. Some people don't come into your life with noise or promises. They come quietly, like a whisper that becomes the reason you start listening again. The days turned into weeks, and soon the rhythm of life inside the house changed completely. The cries that once filled the halls had softened into laughter, small bursts of joy that came from the nursery each morning. The widower would wake before dawn, as he always did, but the sound of the baby's soft giggles made something inside him ease. The old cook had brought peace into a home that had been drowning in sorrow, though she never said much about it. She just worked quietly, as if healing a broken house was part of her duty. She moved through the rooms like someone who belonged there, not because of who she was, but because of what she carried: kindness. She never asked for recognition. She never spoke of her own life. But every action, every small detail, carried care. When she hummed, the sound filled the walls like sunlight spilling into dark corners. The widower began to notice it more each day. He found himself standing at the doorway, watching without meaning to, his eyes drawn to the way she held the baby, steady and gentle, as if the world outside didn't exist. Sometimes, when the wind blew dust through the windows, she would close them carefully, murmuring under her breath, "The little one catches cold easy." It wasn't just the child she cared for. She began tending to the garden again, bringing back vegetables, herbs, and color that had long faded. She cooked the way people who love do, slow, patient, full of heart. The house, once gray and still, began to smell of bread, stews, and warmth. The widower didn't know how to speak about what he felt. He wasn't used to gratitude. His words were always short, half swallowed by the weight of grief. But one afternoon, as he stood outside mending a fence, he saw her through the open door. She was laughing, really laughing, as the baby tugged at her apron. It was a soft, unguarded sound, and for a moment he just stood there, forgetting his work. That laugh didn't belong to the house of sorrow he had built. It belonged to something new. He found himself thinking about her more often, not in the way of admiration or longing, but in quiet respect. She had stayed when no one else had. She had brought warmth without asking for anything. And in her calm, he found a strange kind of strength. She didn't try to fix him or his pain. She just filled the space where pain had lived with small, ordinary acts of care. That somehow was what changed everything. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, he sat on the porch, the baby in his arms. She had fallen asleep, her tiny hand gripping his finger. He wasn't sure how to hold her properly yet. He was still learning, but he tried. The cook stepped outside with a blanket, her face glowing softly in the amber light. "You'll catch cold out here," she said. He nodded and she draped the blanket gently over his shoulders, careful not to wake the child. "You're doing well with her," she said quietly. He looked down at the baby, her cheeks round and pink. "I'm trying," he replied. "That's all she needs," the cook said. Her voice was kind, but there was something deeper in it, a tired understanding of life, the kind that comes from years of being overlooked but never giving up. She turned to go back inside, and he found himself saying her name for the first time in months. "Thank you," he said simply. She paused at the door, gave a small nod, and smiled. "Just doing what's right, sir." After she left, he sat there for a long time, watching the last bit of sunlight fade. The baby stirred softly against his chest. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, and for once the sound didn't feel lonely. The next morning, the cook was in the kitchen before dawn, as always. He could hear her singing softly as she worked, the rhythm of her voice blending with the clinking of pots. He walked in, carrying the baby, and she looked up in surprise. "You're early today," she said. "She wakes with the birds," he said, smiling faintly. The cook chuckled. "Then she'll grow strong." She reached out, and the baby stretched her tiny hands toward her, cooing. The widower handed her over, their hands brushing for a brief moment. It was nothing, just a passing touch, but something about it lingered, simple, steady, like everything she did. Later that day, rain rolled in. The storm came suddenly, the kind that turned the sky dark and made the fields shine with wet earth. The baby grew restless, startled by the thunder. The widower paced the floor while the cook soothed her, whispering lullabies. When lightning flashed, he saw their reflections in the window, her holding the baby close, her eyes calm even in the storm, him standing nearby, unsure of what he was feeling. When the storm passed, the air smelled fresh, and the world outside was quiet again. The cook rocked the baby until she fell asleep, then set her down gently. She turned to find him still watching her, a question in his eyes he didn't know how to ask. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've been up since dawn." "I could say the same to you," he replied. She gave a small shrug. "Rest isn't something I've ever had much use for." He wanted to say something then, something about how much she'd done, how she'd given more than anyone had a right to. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just nodded. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound of the baby's quiet breathing filled the hall. For the first time, he didn't feel haunted by silence. Instead, he felt the faint rhythm of life returning to the house, steady and sure. Down the hall, the cook sat by the window, the lantern beside her flickering low. She looked out at the wet fields, her face soft with thought. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this: she had done something that mattered. In a house once filled with sorrow, she had built something like peace. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both felt it. The quiet understanding that bound them, born not from love or beauty, but from the simple, human need to stay when no one else would. The air turned colder as autumn crept across the plains. The leaves outside the house shifted from green to deep gold, and the mornings carried a chill that made the windows fog with the breath of dawn. Inside, the house was no longer the hollow, lifeless shell it once was. The smell of baking bread and firewood filled every corner, the baby's laughter mingling with the sound of the kettle whistling on the stove. Life, slow and quiet, had taken root again. The widower had begun to spend more time inside. The fields were tended, the fences mended, but it was the small things that began to hold his attention. The creak of the rocking chair, the baby's giggle when she saw him, the soft sound of the cook humming while she stirred a pot. He still moved with a heaviness in his steps, but his eyes had changed. They no longer looked at the world as something that had already ended. He started helping with chores he once thought beneath him. Sometimes he fetched water or chopped firewood, not because it was needed, but because he wanted to stay near the rhythm that filled the house. The cook never commented, but he could tell she noticed. When she handed him a cup of coffee in the morning, her eyes carried quiet gratitude, though neither of them said the words. One evening, as the sun was sinking behind the hills, the cook sat outside on the porch with the baby wrapped in a blanket. The wind played with her hair as she rocked slowly, the baby asleep in her arms. The widower stepped out silently, standing beside her for a moment before taking a seat. The wooden boards creaked beneath his boots. For a while neither of them spoke. The sky burned orange and pink before fading into soft purple, and the sounds of crickets filled the air. "She's growing fast," the cook said after a long pause. He nodded. "She looks like her mother." There was a quiet between them that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that comes from understanding rather than distance. The cook looked down at the baby and smiled faintly. "She'll have her kindness too, I think," she said softly. He turned toward her, studying her face in the dim light. The lines etched from years of work and worry looked softer in the glow of sunset. "You've done more for her than anyone could have," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I just did what needed to be done." He wanted to say more, but the words didn't come. He only nodded and looked back at the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight slipped behind the hills. That night the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The baby woke crying, startled by the storm. The cook hurried to the nursery, her steps steady even as thunder rolled across the sky. The widower followed, standing in the doorway as she soothed the child. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried calm through the room. When the baby finally settled, she turned and saw him watching. "You should rest, sir," she said, adjusting the blanket. He shook his head. "Couldn't sleep anyway." She gave a small smile. "Then you might as well hold her a while. It helps." He hesitated, then stepped forward. She handed the baby over gently, her hands brushing his as she did. The warmth of that brief touch startled him. He looked down at the baby, so small and peaceful now, and something deep within him stirred, something like gratitude or perhaps healing. The cook stood beside him, her voice barely audible over the rain. "You're good with her now," she said. "She trusts you." "She trusts you more," he replied. She chuckled softly. "Maybe she just knows who stayed." Her words hung in the air, not sharp, but honest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she had become part of his home as much as the walls and the air itself. He didn't know when that happened. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was slow, steady, like rain soaking into dry earth. The next morning the storm was gone. The sky was clear, washed clean by the night's rain. The widower stepped outside early, watching the sunlight break across the wet fields. He thought about the words she had said, asterisk who stayed asterisk, and felt something shift quietly inside him. Later that day, he found her in the garden, sleeves rolled up, dirt on her hands as she dug at the soil. The baby was lying nearby on a blanket, reaching for the sunlight with tiny fingers. He stood for a moment, watching them before walking closer. "You're planting again," he said. She smiled without looking up. "The earth still listens if you care to speak to it." He crouched beside her, picking up a handful of soil. "It's been a long time since I tried." "Then start again," she said simply. It was a small moment, but it felt larger than it seemed. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. When she finally looked at him, there was no awkwardness, only quiet understanding. In the days that followed, the two of them worked together more often. She cooked, he fetched wood. She tended the garden, he fixed the fence. The baby grew stronger, always laughing when she saw them together. The house that had once been filled with grief now breathed with life and movement. One afternoon, as she washed clothes by the well, a neighbor passing by stopped and watched. "Didn't think you'd keep her around this long," the man said with a half-smile. The widower standing nearby looked up sharply. "She keeps this house alive," he said firmly. The neighbor laughed awkwardly and walked off, but the words lingered. The cook heard them too. She didn't say anything, but when their eyes met, he saw that she had understood. That evening, he sat by the fire with the baby asleep in his lap. The cook worked quietly in the kitchen, humming the same soft tune she always did. He looked around the room, the firelight flickering against the walls, the warm smell of stew filling the air, the gentle peace that had returned, and realized how different everything had become. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how long this quiet would last. But for now, in that golden light, with the baby safe and the woman who had brought them both back from the edge of despair working just a few steps away, he knew one simple truth. This was no longer a house of loss. It was a home again. Winter came early that year. The mornings were white with frost, and every breath hung in the air like smoke. The old ranch house creaked under the cold, its wooden frame protesting against the chill winds that swept across the plains. But inside, warmth lingered. The fire burned steady in the hearth, the smell of bread and stew filling the rooms. The baby had started walking now, small, unsteady steps that brought laughter where once there had only been silence. Her laughter carried through the house like a new song, and every time it echoed, the widower found himself smiling without realizing it. The cook had grown busier with the season. She woke before dawn, her breath visible in the cold kitchen as she kneaded dough with red hands. The widower often found her there, sleeves rolled up, her face glowing from the warmth of the stove. He started helping more, chopping wood, carrying water, mending small things around the place. They rarely spoke much, but their silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt easy, familiar, full of quiet understanding. One evening, a heavy snow began to fall. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, but the firelight danced strong. The cook sat near the hearth, sewing a small blanket for the baby. The widower sat across from her, mending one of his old leather gloves. The baby slept between them, bundled in wool, her small chest rising and falling with each soft breath. He looked at the cook for a long moment before speaking. "You ever think about leaving here?" he asked. She didn't look up from her sewing. "No," she said. "There's no place I'd rather be." He nodded slowly. "I guess I've been meaning to ask why you stayed." "You didn't have to." She paused, her needle frozen mid-stitch. "I stayed because someone had to," she said softly. "Someone had to keep this house from dying completely. Someone had to care for that child." He leaned back, eyes on the fire. "And what about me?" Her gaze lifted to his, steady but kind. "You needed someone too, sir, you just didn't know it." The words settled between them, warm and true. He didn't reply, but his throat tightened, and for a moment the crackling fire was the only sound. Outside, the storm worsened. Snow piled high against the door and the wind rattled the glass. The cook stood to check the windows, tucking blankets along the sills to keep the cold from creeping in. When she turned back, he was already at the door, testing the latch. "You don't need to worry about that," she said. "The wind's got its own way, it'll stop when it's done." He gave a faint smile. "You sound like you've been fighting storms your whole life," she chuckled quietly. "Maybe I have. But I've learned they don't last forever." When she sat again, the baby stirred, her tiny hand reaching out from the blanket. The cook's expression softened instantly. She brushed a hand across the child's cheek, her voice lowering to a whisper. "She's a good girl," she said. "She is," he replied, "because of you." Her eyes glistened, though she quickly looked away. She's her mother's daughter. I only filled the space until she could stand on her own." He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "You did more than fill a space," he said quietly. "You brought this place back to life." For a moment she didn't answer. The wind outside roared, but inside everything stood still. The baby shifted, her small voice breaking the silence, and both of them smiled without meaning to. Days passed, and the storm finally lifted. The sun returned, cold but bright, glittering off the snow. The widower spent the morning clearing paths while the cook prepared a meal that filled the house with warmth once again. When he came back inside, shaking snow from his coat, he found her humming by the stove, the baby giggling in her arms. "You're laughing again," he said, brushing his hands dry. The cook looked up. "It's hard not to when she does." He watched them for a long time, the sight stirring something deep in his chest, something close to peace, something almost like love, though he wouldn't call it that, not yet. It was softer, steadier. It was belonging. That evening, when the baby had fallen asleep, they sat together again, the fire burning low. He looked at her and spoke carefully, his voice low. "You know, when you first said those words, 'No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby,' I didn't understand the kind of courage it took to say them. I do now." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "It wasn't courage, it was truth. People see what they want to see, but the baby didn't care about that. She just needed love. And you gave it," he said softly. Her hands folded in her lap. "That's all I ever knew how to give." He stared at the fire again, the light dancing over the worn lines of his face. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," he said. "You stayed. That's something most people don't do." She didn't respond, but her eyes softened, and in the stillness that unspoken understanding grew deeper. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world was quiet, silver under the moonlight. The next morning the baby woke early, her laughter filling the halls. The cook followed her into the parlor, her hair loose from its bun, her smile bright despite the tiredness in her eyes. The widower watched them from the doorway, his hands resting on the frame. He realized then that the house didn't just belong to him anymore. It belonged to all three of them. The woman who had stayed, the child who had brought light, and the man who had finally learned to feel again. The days stretched on, calm and bright. Neighbors began to visit again, drawn by the smell of good food and the laughter that drifted from the windows. Some whispered still, curious about the strange bond in that quiet house. But neither the widower nor the cook paid them any mind. Theirs was a world built on something stronger than judgment, built on kindness, on presence, on the power of choosing to stay when everyone else had left. And though neither of them said it, they both knew. The house no longer carried the sound of grief. It carried the sound of life, of footsteps, laughter, and warmth, echoing through every wall that had once known only silence. The snow melted slowly, leaving behind soft patches of green beneath the pale winter sun. The days began to stretch longer again, each one a little brighter than the last. The widower spent his mornings repairing the fences that had been buried by snow and his afternoons inside, where warmth now lived as easily as breath. The cook kept busy as always, though the rhythm of her work had changed. It wasn't just duty anymore, it was care, the kind that came from belonging. The baby, who now toddled about with curious steps, filled the house with life. Her laughter drifted down the halls, chasing away the last ghosts that had once haunted the place. Sometimes she followed the cook into the kitchen, tugging at her skirt, babbling nonsense words that only she seemed to understand. The cook would bend down, smiling softly, and say, "You've got your mother's stubbornness, little one." Then she'd glance toward the doorway where the widower often stood watching, his arms folded, that faint smile that came so easily now resting on his face. Spring arrived quietly, carrying with it the smell of fresh soil and wildflowers. The fields outside bloomed again, the grass tall and green. The widower began planting with a new kind of energy. He worked with purpose, not just for survival but for something that felt like hope. Every evening when he returned covered in dust and sun, the sight of the two waiting inside, the cook stirring supper, the child playing nearby, felt like coming home. He didn't say it aloud, but the truth was simple. He no longer saw her as the cook. Somewhere between the silence of grief and the laughter of new days, she had become the heart of the house. He caught himself listening for her footsteps in the morning, for her soft humming that always seemed to settle the air. And when she wasn't in the room, the space felt noticeably empty. One warm evening, they ate supper on the porch. The baby sat between them, trying to feed herself with clumsy hands, giggling as more food ended up on the table than in her mouth. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the world in gold and orange. The widower watched the light fade and said quietly, "It's strange how fast things can change." The cook looked up. "The world always changes, sir. We just notice it when it hurts less." He thought about that for a moment, his eyes tracing the horizon. "I used to think this place would never feel alive again." She smiled, not at him but at the child. "It's not the house that changes, it's the people inside it." He looked at her then, really looked. The light from the setting sun caught her face, softening the lines carved by years of work. There was nothing grand or polished about her, no fine clothes, no practiced grace. But there was something steady and real, something he'd come to rely on. He realized she was more beautiful in that moment than anyone he'd ever known, not because of how she looked, but because of how she stayed. Later that night, after the baby had fallen asleep, the wind began to stir again. The sound reminded him of that first night she'd offered to stay, the same quiet bravery in her voice when she said, "No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby." Those words echoed differently now. They weren't about pity anymore. They were about strength. He walked to the kitchen where she was finishing the dishes. The firelight flickered across the walls, warm and steady. She looked up as he entered. "You're still awake," she said softly. "So are you," he replied. She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled faintly. "Habit, I suppose. Hard to sleep when you've got things to think about." He stepped closer. "What kind of things?" "Tomorrow's work, the garden, the child." She hesitated before adding, "and the future, maybe." He leaned against the table, his voice quieter. "You ever think about what comes next?" She met his eyes, uncertain. "Next," he nodded. "After all this, after everything we've lived through." She looked down at her hands, calloused and worn. "I never thought that far ahead, sir. I've never been needed long enough to think about what comes next." He was silent for a moment. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Then he said, "You're needed here." Her eyes lifted slowly to his. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice, the weight of every word. "Not just for the baby," he continued. "For me. For this home." The air between them was still. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the wind outside brushing against the windows. She didn't speak right away. When she finally did, her voice trembled slightly. "You don't have to say that, sir." "I know," he said. "But it's true." Something passed between them then, quiet, honest, unspoken. The kind of moment that didn't need grand gestures to be understood. She looked at him, her eyes shining, then nodded once, as if accepting a truth she'd always known but never dared to believe. The baby stirred in the next room, letting out a soft cry. The cook turned instinctively, moving toward the sound, but the widower stopped her gently. "I'll go," he said. She froze for a second, then smiled. A small, tired but genuine smile, and let him pass. He lifted the baby into his arms, rocking her gently until she settled back into sleep. When he looked up, the cook was standing in the doorway, watching. For the first time, she wasn't just the caretaker. She was part of the picture, woven into the fabric of that home as deeply as the walls themselves. The night grew quiet again. Outside, the wind carried the scent of fresh grass and the promise of spring. The widower placed the baby back in her crib and turned toward the door, where the cook still stood. Their eyes met, and though neither of them spoke, something in that silence felt complete. When morning came, light poured through the windows in soft waves. The smell of coffee filled the air. The cook moved through the kitchen as she always did, steady and sure. The widower stepped in behind her, the baby balanced on one arm, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had finally found its balance too. The grief that once clung to the house had loosened its hold. In its place, Something new had taken root, quiet, enduring, and real. The kind of love that doesn't need to be declared, only lived. The kind that starts not with beauty or grand promises, but with the simple, powerful choice to stay.